July 15th, 1099. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Jerusalem's blood-stained walls as Duke Godfrey of Bouillon received news that should have meant the end of everything. 3 dust-covered scouts stumbled into his command tent, their horses lathered with foam, bearing reports of an Egyptian army so vast it defied comprehension. Al-Afdal ibn Badr al-Jamali, the most feared general in Islam, was marching north with 20,000 fresh troops to reclaim the holy city. Against this oceanic force, Godfrey could muster perhaps 100-200 effective fighting men. The mathematics were terrifying. 17 Egyptian warriors for every Crusader knight. Picture this nightmare. Jerusalem had fallen just 2 weeks earlier after a siege that consumed nearly everything. The Crusader army that had marched from Europe with 60,000 souls now barely filled a village square. Disease, battle, and the brutal Levantine heat had reduced the great expedition to this pitiful remnant. Each surviving knight represented years of training and fortune equal to an entire manor, but flesh and steel meant nothing against such overwhelming numbers. Godfrey himself bore the scars of Jerusalem's conquest. At 39, the Duke of Lower Lorraine had proven himself the expedition's finest battlefield commander, but even his tactical genius seemed inadequate against Al-Afdal's host. The Egyptian vizier commanded 5,000 Mamluk heavy cavalry, slave soldiers, trained from childhood in mounted warfare. Behind them marched 15,000 infantry, including Sudanese spearmen, whose bronze-tipped weapons could punch through mail like parchment. The Egyptian baggage train alone required 3,000 camels. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about that sweltering morning in Godfrey's tent. The choice wasn't simply between fighting and dying. Staying in Jerusalem meant enduring siege by forces that had retaken the city from Seljuk Turks just 1 year earlier. Al-Afdal knew every weakness in the ancient walls. Egyptian siege engineers could starve out the defenders within weeks, turning the Crusader triumph into history's cruelest irony. But marching out meant certain annihilation in open battle. Traditional Crusader tactics relied on heavy cavalry charges that shattered enemy formations through sheer momentum. Against Al-Afdal's disciplined ranks, such attacks would accomplish nothing but spectacular suicide. The Egyptian commander had broken larger armies using proven methods. Mamluk archers would shower approaching cavalry with arrows, then heavy lancers would finish survivors. Simple, effective, inevitable. Raymond of Toulouse, the expedition's eldest commander at 59, counseled desperate defense. Strip Jerusalem's population, concentrate every man behind the strongest walls, pray for relief from Antioch. Tancred of Antioch, barely 25 but already legendary for battlefield audacity, argued for immediate attack before Egyptian preparations completed. Both solutions led to destruction. The scouts' reports painted Al-Afdal's position with precision that chilled veteran hearts. The Egyptian army had made camp near Ascalon, 12 miles southwest of Jerusalem, controlling the coastal road that connected Egypt to Syria. From there, they could either besiege the holy city or intercept any Crusader attempt to retreat toward Antioch. The trap was perfect. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Jerusalem's conquered towers, Godfrey made his calculations. 200 men against 20,000. Exhausted knights against fresh troops. Desperate Christians against confident Muslims. Every military manual ever written declared the outcome inevitable. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Godfrey's decision. The choice wasn't between victory and defeat. It was between two kinds of destruction. And in that impossible moment, a revolutionary tactic was born that would rewrite the rules of medieval warfare forever. Al-Afdal's war machine that emerged from the Egyptian delta represented the pinnacle of medieval military organization. Picture this terrifying spectacle approaching Ascalon's walls. The vizier's 20,000 warriors marched in perfect columns stretching 8 miles across the coastal plain. Their daily consumption of grain, dates, and water equaled a city of 50,000 civilians. The dust cloud from their advance could be seen from Jerusalem's towers, a brown smudge against the azure Mediterranean sky that grew larger each hour. At the army's core rode 5,000 Mamluks, slave soldiers purchased as children and trained exclusively for mounted warfare. Each carried a composite bow capable of piercing mail at 200 yards, plus lance, sword, and mace. Their horses, bred from Arabian and Barb stock, could sustain galloping speeds that European destriers managed only in short bursts. These weren't conscripted peasants or feudal levies. These were professional killers who had crushed Fatimid enemies from Sudan to Syria. Behind the cavalry came 15,000 infantry, organized in precise formations that had conquered half of North Africa. Sudanese spearmen, their bronze points gleaming like stars. Nubian archers whose bows required 150 pounds of draw strength. Syrian engineers hauling siege equipment that could reduce Jerusalem's walls to rubble within weeks. The logistics alone demonstrated Islamic military superiority. Where Crusader armies barely managed basic supply lines, Al-Afdal's quartermasters coordinated provisions for forces larger than most European cities. But here's what chroniclers barely mention about those crucial days in mid-July. While Al-Afdal prepared methodically for siege, the Crusader leadership was disintegrating. Raymond of Toulouse, the expedition's nominal commander, had fallen gravely ill from wounds received during Jerusalem's assault. Fever ravaged his body as he lay semi-conscious in a requisitioned palace, unable to provide strategic direction when it was most desperately needed. Without his unifying authority, the remaining nobles fell into familiar patterns of mistrust and competition. Tancred of Antioch controlled perhaps 400 men, but his forces were scattered across newly conquered territories, establishing garrison control over a population that outnumbered them 50-1. Robert of Normandy commanded another 300 knights, yet spent more time arguing over Jerusalem's spoils than preparing defences. The great Crusader army that had terrified Islam from Nicaea to Antioch no longer existed as a cohesive fighting force. Intelligence reports trickling into Godfrey's headquarters painted an increasingly desperate picture. Egyptian scouts probed Jerusalem's perimeter daily, mapping defensive positions, counting defenders, identifying weak points in walls hastily repaired after the recent siege. Al-Afdal wasn't rushing toward hasty assault. He was conducting methodical preparation for total victory. The numbers grew worse with each passing hour. Dysentery struck the Crusader camp, reducing effective fighters by dozens daily. Summer heat in the Judean hills reached temperatures that left European knights prostrate by midday, their mail armor becoming furnaces that cooked flesh beneath steel. Water sources outside Jerusalem required dangerous foraging expeditions as Egyptian cavalry patrols tightened their noose around the holy city. Then, everything changed on the evening of August 11th. A final council of war gathered in the captured dome of the Rock, now hastily converted into a Christian chapel. Godfrey spread maps across tables still stained with Muslim blood, studying routes, calculating distances, weighing impossible options. The assembled commanders represented Christianity's last hope in the East, yet their combined forces barely matched a single Egyptian division. What happened next defied every principle of medieval strategy. Instead of preparing for siege defense or negotiating terms of surrender, Godfrey announced the most audacious military decision since Hannibal crossed the Alps. They would march out at dawn and attack Al-Afdal's overwhelming host in open battle. The assembled knights stared in stunned silence. Military suicide had never sounded so calmly reasoned. August the 12th, 4:17 a.m. Absolute darkness shrouded the Judean hills as 1,200 Crusaders began their final march toward eternity. No trumpets announced their departure. No banners flew in the pre-dawn stillness. Godfrey of Bouillon had ordered complete silence as his tiny army crept through Jerusalem's gates, like ghosts seeking their own graves. Each footstep on the ancient stones echoed with finality. The formation that emerged defied every convention of Crusader warfare. Instead of the traditional heavy cavalry vanguard followed by struggling infantry, Godfrey had created something revolutionary. 3 coordinated divisions moved in perfect synchronization across the rocky terrain. He commanded the center with 400 knights and men-at-arms. Raymond of Toulouse, despite his fever, insisted on leading the left wing with 350 infantry. Tancred of Antioch controlled the right with 450 mixed cavalry and foot soldiers. Here's where legend meets tactical reality. Medieval armies typically marched in loose columns that required hours to form battle lines. Godfrey's force advanced already organized for immediate combat, each division maintaining precise intervals that allowed instant deployment. The innovation represented years of hard-won experience compressed into desperate necessity. These weren't the enthusiastic pilgrims who had departed Europe 4 years earlier. These were veterans who understood that survival meant adapting or dying. The 12-mile approach march through darkness tested human endurance beyond normal limits. Knights in 80-pound mail, hauberks struggled across broken ground while maintaining absolute silence. Infantry carried 14-foot spears that caught on rocks and scrub brush with every step. The august heat, even at night, left men gasping for water they couldn't spare. Yet discipline, held with iron determination, born of knowing that a single noise, one stumbling horse, one clanking piece of equipment, could alert Egyptian sentries and doom them all. By 5:30 a.m., the eastern horizon began glowing pale gold as Godfrey's scouts reported Egyptian positions ahead. Al-Afdal's massive camp sprawled across the coastal plain like a temporary city. Cooking fires dotted the landscape where 20,000 men prepared morning meals in comfortable confidence. The Egyptian commander had positioned his forces with mathematical precision. Heavy cavalry picketed near the sea to prevent escape. Infantry camps blocked inland routes. Command tents occupied the center, protected by rings of Mamluk guards. But Al-Afdal had made one critical miscalculation. His overwhelming numerical superiority had bred complacency. Egyptian sentries watched for messengers and supply convoys, not suicide attacks by forces they outnumbered 17-1. The great general's tactical doctrine assumed rational enemies who understood mathematical impossibility. He had never faced desperate Christians, convinced that God demanded miracles. Dawn broke with shocking suddenness across the Mediterranean sky, revealing the Crusader divisions positioned just 400 yards from the sleeping Egyptian camp. Godfrey raised his sword, morning light catching the steel like divine fire. The signal passed instantly through prearranged hand gestures, no horns, no battle cries, just sudden coordinated violence erupting from nowhere. The outer Egyptian pickets died before they could scream warnings. Tancred's cavalry struck like lightning, spearing sentries who were still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Raymond's infantry stormed through gaps in the camp perimeter, cutting down confused guards who couldn't understand how Christians had materialized from empty air. Godfrey's center division punched straight toward Al-Afdal's command position, carving through tents where Egyptian officers struggled into armor while still half asleep. What happened in those first 20 minutes defied every military manual ever written. Surprise attacks succeeded through careful planning and superior intelligence. The Crusaders possessed neither advantage except desperation, refined into perfect tactical execution. They had achieved the impossible, complete strategic surprise against a force that should have detected them miles away. In 20 minutes, the inevitable had become unthinkable. But Al-Afdal wasn't finished. What happened next would test whether courage could overcome mathematics when the Egyptians finally understood what had struck them. The Egyptian camp exploded into chaos as 20,000 sleeping warriors awakened to find death already among them. Picture the sensory overload, Crusader steel cutting through canvas walls, screams in Arabic echoing across tent rows, the crash of collapsing pavilions as panicked horses trampled guy ropes. Al-Afdal's perfectly organized military city transformed into a slaughter pen in 17 minutes of coordinated violence that should never have been possible. Tancred's 450 cavalry carved through the Egyptian horse lines like scythes through wheat. Mamluk warriors, the finest heavy cavalry in Islam, died struggling into saddles, while Christian lances found gaps between mail rings. The mathematics were brutal. Each mounted crusader faced potential combat with 40 enemies, but surprise compressed those odds into individual encounters where superior armor and desperate fury overcame numerical disadvantage. But then Al-Afdal's tactical genius emerged from the chaos. The Egyptian vizier hadn't conquered half of North Africa through panic. From his command position near the sea, he watched disaster unfold with calculating precision. His drum signals echoed across the camp, calling scattered units to predetermined rally points. Within 30 minutes, 5,000 Mamluk cavalry had withdrawn beyond Crusader reach, forming disciplined ranks on the coastal plain where numbers could finally matter. The counterattack struck like divine retribution. Egyptian heavy cavalry thundered forward in waves that shook the earth beneath their hooves. The sound defied description. 20,000 iron-shod hooves hitting packed sand created percussive force that men felt in their bones before hearing reached their ears. Dust clouds rose 100 feet, turning morning sunlight into apocalyptic twilight. Godfrey's center division, caught scattered through the Egyptian camp, faced annihilation. His 400 knights had spread too thin pursuing fleeing enemies. Their formation dissolved in the intoxication of impossible success. Now, Mamluk lancers bore down on isolated groups of Christians who couldn't retreat fast enough to reach defensive positions. Here's where desperation met tactical brilliance. Instead of ordering retreat that would become massacre, Godfrey commanded advance. The remaining Crusader divisions abandoned camp looting to form defensive squares that bristled with 14-foot spears. Infantry locked shields in overlapping walls, while knights dismounted to fight on foot, their heavy armor providing protection that mobility couldn't match against such overwhelming numbers. The collision, when it came, redefined violence. Mamluk cavalry struck Crusader formations at full gallop, lances shattering against overlocked shields, horses screaming as they impaled themselves on Christian spears. The front ranks of both armies disappeared in mutual destruction. Egyptian riders died pressed against Frankish steel. Crusader infantry collapsed under the weight of fallen horses and men. Casualties mounted with mathematical precision. In 27 minutes of close combat, 800 Egyptian cavalry lay dead or dying. The Crusaders had lost 150 men, grievous losses for their tiny force, yet the exchange rate remained catastrophically in their favor. Al-Afdal's overwhelming numbers were bleeding away against Christian discipline and superior defensive tactics, but the Egyptian commander wasn't retreating. He was learning. The next assault combined mounted archery with infantry support, forcing Crusader squares to contract, while arrows fell like steel rain. Mamluk composite bows, capable of piercing mail at 200 yards, found gaps in formations stressed beyond breaking points. Young knights collapsed with Turkish shafts protruding from shoulders and thighs. The crisis came when Raymond of Toulouse, leading from the front despite his fever, took an arrow through the throat. The old count staggered but remained upright, blood streaming down his surcoat as he continued shouting orders through vocal cords that barely functioned. His men, seeing their commander dying on his feet, fought with fury that transcended human limitations. Tancred seized the moment. His cavalry, reformed after their initial rampage, struck Al-Afdal's flank at precisely the instant when Egyptian attention focused on Raymond's wavering division. The young Norman prince led from the front, his lance taking an Egyptian emir through the chest at full gallop. Behind him, 200 mounted knights carved through packed infantry who couldn't form ranks quickly enough to resist. The mathematics had shifted. By 8:30 a.m., Al-Afdal faced a tactical impossibility. His army had lost 2,000 dead against 400 Crusader casualties. More critically, Egyptian morale was cracking as warriors who had conquered from Cairo to Damascus found themselves systematically destroyed by forces they outnumbered 10-1. Then, Godfrey made a decision that defied every rule of medieval warfare. Instead of consolidating defensive success, he ordered general advance. The entire Crusader army would attack Al-Afdal's remaining 18,000 troops in open battle. The silence that followed Godfrey's final charge carried weight beyond human comprehension. By 9:15 a.m., the coastal plain near Ascalon resembled Hell's own marketplace. 7,000 Egyptian dead carpeted the battlefield in formations that told the story of systematic destruction. Mamluk cavalry, Islam's finest horsemen, lay twisted among their mounts in geometric patterns where Crusader squares had held firm. Sudanese infantry sprawled in windrows where Norman lances had carved bloody furrows through packed ranks. Al-Afdal's mighty host had simply disintegrated. The Egyptian vizier himself fled toward Ascalon's walls with perhaps 3,000 survivors from an army that had numbered 20,000 at dawn. Behind him lay not just military defeat, but the complete collapse of Fatimid power projection into the Levant. The mathematical impossibility had become documented reality, witnessed by chroniclers from both sides. Godfrey dismounted among the carnage, his sword arm hanging useless from wounds that would never fully heal. The Duke of Lower Lorraine had personally killed 11 Egyptian warriors, including 2 Mamluk emirs whose bodies lay within reach of his banner. Yet victory's cost showed in every line of his battle-scarred face. The Crusader army that had achieved the impossible numbered barely 800 effective fighters from the 200 who had marched out at dawn. The battlefield spoils defied belief. Al-Afdal's baggage train contained treasures accumulated through decades of Egyptian conquest. Gold dinars by the thousand, silk from Damascus worth a king's ransom, spices from Indian Ocean trade routes, weapons and armor crafted in the finest workshops of Cairo. Individual Crusader knights found themselves suddenly wealthy beyond European noble standards, their participation in the impossible victory earning material rewards that would transform their families' fortunes for generations. But here's what the chronicles barely mention about those crucial hours after victory. While common soldiers celebrated and counted plunder, the surviving commanders grappled with strategic consequences that extended far beyond immediate triumph. Tancred of Antioch, bleeding from 3 wounds, but still mounted, advocated immediate pursuit of Al-Afdal's remnants. Capture Ascalon itself, he argued. Complete the destruction of Egyptian power in Palestine. Raymond of Toulouse, barely conscious from blood loss, yet still commanding his division, counselled caution with words that emerged as barely audible whispers. The old count understood what younger knights could not grasp. They had achieved tactical miracle through desperation and perfect timing, but such circumstances could never be replicated. Better to consolidate gains than risk everything on continued aggression. The human cost became apparent as battlefield surgeons tallied casualties with brutal precision. 300 Crusader dead, including some of Christianity's finest knights. Another 200 wounded so severely they would never fight again. Raymond himself would die from his throat wound within 6 months, the greatest strategic mind of the First Crusade, consumed by infection that medieval medicine couldn't treat. Yet the strategic transformation was complete. In 4 hours of impossible warfare, 200 exhausted Christians had eliminated the last serious threat to their nascent kingdom. Al-Afdal's defeat meant no Egyptian army would challenge Crusader control of Palestine for the next 2 decades. The Fatimid Caliphate, after losing their finest troops in mathematical impossibility, would retreat to defensive positions around the Nile Delta. Individual acts of heroism emerged from survivor accounts that would echo through centuries of military history. Brother William, a hospitaller knight who held a breach alone for 7 minutes while reinforcements arrived. Sergeant Hugh the Breton, whose crossbow killed 6 Mamluk officers before an Egyptian scimitar found his neck. Anonymous foot soldiers, whose names appear in no chronicle, but whose desperate courage made victory possible. Picture the psychological impact on both armies. Egyptian survivors would return to Cairo bearing tales that defied belief. How could 200 Franks destroy forces that outnumbered them 17-1? Islamic military doctrine, based on mathematical calculation and tactical superiority, offered no explanation for such complete reversal of natural order. The Crusaders themselves struggled to comprehend their achievement. Many attributed victory to divine intervention, claiming they had witnessed angels fighting beside Christian ranks. Others recognized tactical innovation combined with perfect timing had overcome impossible odds through human agency rather than supernatural intervention. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the battlefield, Godfrey made the decision that would define his kingdom's future. No pursuit of Al-Afdal's remnants, no siege of Ascalon, consolidation of gains rather than risky expansion. The impossible victory had taught him that miracles couldn't be repeated on demand. The strategic earthquake that began at dawn near Ascalon's walls rippled across the medieval world for decades. Within 18 months of their impossible victory, the Crusaders had transformed from desperate survivors into the dominant military power in the eastern Mediterranean. The tactical innovations born from mathematical desperation became standard doctrine for Christian armies from Antioch to Tripoli. Dawn attacks, coordinated division movements, infantry-cavalry integration that had emerged from necessity now spread throughout the Crusader states as proven methodology. But the deeper consequences extended far beyond tactical manuals. Al-Afdal's catastrophic defeat marked the end of Fatimid military credibility. The Egyptian Caliphate, which had ruled from Spain to Sudan for 2 centuries, never again fielded armies capable of challenging Crusader expansion. Their naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean remained, but without land forces to exploit it, Egyptian power withered into regional defensive posturing around the Nile Delta. Islamic military doctrine itself underwent fundamental revision because of Ascalon's lessons. Muslim commanders who had relied on numerical superiority and conventional tactics discovered that desperate enemies operating under impossible pressure could achieve results that defied mathematical calculation. Future Islamic strategies emphasized avoiding pitched battles against consolidated Crusader forces, preferring siege warfare and attrition campaigns that negated Christian tactical advantages. The Crusader kingdom's survival depended entirely on the precedent established during those 4 hours of impossible combat. When Saladin finally emerged to challenge Christian dominance nearly a century later, he studied Ascalon's lessons with scholarly precision. The great Kurdish commander understood that Frankish armies fighting for survival represented completely different opponents than Frankish armies fighting for conquest. His strategy at Hattin deliberately avoided giving Crusader forces the desperation that had made them invincible against Al-Afdal. Individual careers were transformed by participation in the mathematical miracle. Tancred of Antioch leveraged his reputation from Ascalon to establish the most aggressive Crusader principality, expanding Christian control deep into northern Syria through campaigns that copied Godfrey's dawn attack methodology. His tactical manual, written in the months following victory, became required reading for every knight serving in the Latin East. The psychological impact on Christian morale throughout Europe cannot be overstated. Ascalon's victory arrived in Western chronicles as proof that divine favor supported the Crusader cause, even against impossible odds. Recruitment for subsequent expeditions increased dramatically as nobles sought to participate in campaigns that had achieved documented miracles. The impossible had become repeatable through proper preparation and absolute commitment. Yet the battle's most profound lesson involved limitation rather than capability. Godfrey's decision to halt pursuit and consolidate gains demonstrated wisdom that many subsequent commanders ignored to their destruction. Military miracles, however spectacular, remained accidents of timing and circumstance that couldn't be manufactured through willpower alone. The mathematical impossibility that saved Jerusalem in 1099 represented unrepeatable convergence of factors that future battles would lack. Modern military academies study Ascalon primarily as an example of combined arms coordination achieved through desperate innovation. The seamless integration of cavalry shock action with infantry defensive capability anticipated tactical developments that wouldn't become standard until centuries later. Staff colleges from Sandhurst to West Point analysed the battle's lessons about force multiplication through superior coordination and timing. The 800 Crusader survivors who staggered back to Jerusalem that evening had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the medieval world. Their achievement echoed through 2 centuries of subsequent warfare, establishing tactical principles that defined Crusader military doctrine until the kingdom's final collapse in 1291. Every subsequent Christian victory in the East traced its genealogy back to those 4 hours when impossibility became reality through discipline and desperation. July 15th, 1099. The morning sun had blazed mercilessly over Jerusalem as Duke Godfrey received news of approaching annihilation. By sunset on August the 12th, that same sun set over a transformed world where 200 exhausted knights had proven that mathematical impossibility meant nothing against human will refined into perfect tactical execution. They had rewritten the rules of medieval warfare in their own blood, teaching history that the greatest victories emerge not from strength, but from ordinary men refusing to accept defeat when everything they valued hung in the balance.